Hi, I'm Jon Atack, and I'm today dealing with the very flamboyant Chris Shelton. He's delighted that I've used that word to describe him.
Yes, no one's ever said that. I always think of Liberace when you use words like that, you know?
I can just see you coming onto a stage in a silver carriage with two white horses. Right. That's not quite what I was thinking of. I associate the word with Keith Moon, the drummer with the Who.
Oh.
Because that's why I started playing the drums when I was 15. That's what people used to say about me too. I wasn't as good at pulling faces as he was, but
nice.
You know, I can play what he played, you know.
Nice. Well, yes. Well, welcome to Sensibly Speaking podcast as well. This is being dual done for Jon's channel and mine, as always. And I want to thank everybody for welcoming us into your home this week. And we're going to talk about brainwashing.
Brainwashing.
Oh my God. It's still totally, as Jon and I were talking about before the show, it's still very much in my mind right now. This documentary, Stolen Youth, really brought some stuff to mind about how brainwashing really works and the myths surrounding it. And Jon has done some really champion research on this stuff lately. And so we're going to talk about this topic. This is a controversial topic in some circles, but it really shouldn't be. The physical means of going about, changing people's minds when they don't necessarily want to change their minds has been something that's been going on for millennia. This is nothing new in the human experience. But codifying it, breaking it down, deconstructing it, and working out how it all works so that we can resist it, fight it, get rid of it when we see it coming up in our vicinity. That's what this is all about. So, hey, Jon, let's talk.
If we started out with a spectrum, spectrums are very, very fashionable the last 10 years.
Yes.
And we're all on the spectrum somewhere, let's face it. We're all a little bit neurodivergent if we get into it. But at one end of the spectrum, you have the idea that everybody makes up their own mind about stuff. Everybody is rational. This in economics is a doctrine of rational expectations. You can presume that human beings will act rationally. Well, you can if you want. But it's a stupid presumption, frankly, from my experience of human beings.
Yes.
We are not that smart. Then at the other end of the scale, you've got Richard Condon and the Manchurian Candidate, as played by Lawrence Harvey in the original film and Denzel Washington in the remake. And it's a great story. The idea that you can implant a command into somebody and get them to do something. And there is actually some evidence of it, not as found, with the CIA and their MK Ultra, MK Naomi, Project Bluebird, all of this good stuff. They don't appear to have been tremendously successful, though it did produce some incredible stories, like the guy who had a two-way mirror and was having prostitutes give LSD to people so that he could sit and see what happened. And he didn't want to miss a second of it, so he actually had a commode so that he could sit on the commode while watching this happen. And people suggest that the intelligence agencies are in some way perverted. I don't know what they're thinking. They're upstanding Mormons, most of them.
Clearly.
Two-way mirror, sat on the bog, watching prostitutes.
There are things I just have to say, just because it is part of the research and the history of this, in the same way that there are, in the way that there are negatives in the cult fighting world, there are negatives in this government world of what our governments decide to do to us. And this is some of the nastiest shit, to be blunt, that has ever been promulgated upon citizens of a country is some of this MK Ultra shit and the experiments they were doing, and there were hundreds of them. And the only records we've got are the finance records, by the way. They destroyed, at least in terms of public consumption, there's nothing there. We don't know what the hell those guys were getting up to other than their invoices that they left for us, as I understand it. So it's nasty stuff. Nasty.
We do have survivor accounts. So we know, for example, that the president of the World Federation for Mental Health that august body, Ewan Cameron in Canada, was actually systematically wiping people's memories by giving them electric shock treatment interspersed with tanking, sensory deprivation tanks. And there is an interview you can find of a woman who this was subjected to this. And she said it worked. I can't remember anything before the hospital. Then they tried to put in new memories and some control. This subject has become, people have become so fervent about it, this belief that, there is no such thing as brainwashing. Yep. Adam Curtis, who is one of the great documentary makers, and who's really made, Century of the Self or The Power of Nightmares. He's been around since the 70s, making incredible things. He did this bizarre talk, which was in 2012. It's listed on YouTube as Memory Marathon, where he says that the only damage done to members of new religious movements has been by kidnapped deprogrammers. And he then accuses Margaret Singer of having in some way been involved with this. And it's like, I have respected this guy's research for decades, and look how shallow he is. That he's basically taken Scientology's script and trotted it out. Now, I've been directly, personally involved in the recovery, or whatever word we want to use for it, of about 600 former members. And not one of them was kidnapped. Not one of them was deprogrammed. And yet they were still talking about real and awful damage. Mm-hmm. For example, a woman who was shouted at for 2 weeks to have an abortion when she was on Scientology's rehabilitation project force. And when she adamantly refused, she and another pregnant woman were set to shoveling human excrement out of a cesspit. And kind of going, all right, so from Adam Curtis's point of view, that's okay. That's not a reprehensible practice. So seeing how excited people get, there was an academic in Chicago, an associate professor called Benjamin Zeller, who wrote a piece. He'd received a flyer promoting Steve Hassan's excellent cult of Trump, and he decided to write a paper without reading the book, but based upon the flyer. And one of his statements was, it's been proven there's no such thing as brainwashing. Well, before we go to that, let's quickly have a look at what the word brainwashing means. He mistakenly, and it's a common mistake, suggested that a journalist called Edward Hunter, who published a book called Brainwashing, had come up with the term brainwashing.
Right.
It's not true. He says that Hunter was a member of the CIA. That's not true. Hunter was a member of OSS, the precursor to the CIA, up to the end of World War II, and he was an opportunistic journalist. He would later, in an interview with Alan Shefflin, who co-authored The Mind Manipulators, one of the first two books, along with Walter Bowett's book, about MKUltra and MK Naomi, the mind control programs of American, Canadian, and British intelligence. We usually get left out, and this is just the Americans who get all the blame, but it was an international problem.
Yes.
That Alan told me, he said, well, Shefflin told me that he came up with the term brainwashing to describe what the Chinese were doing to their people and what was happening to American prisoners of war in North Korea. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, but hang on a minute. He first used the word on in a publication, the Miami Herald News, on the 24th of September, 1950, which is at the same time that the Incheon offensive is going on in North Korea. There were no American prisoners of war talking to camera at the point where he used the word. So he carried on using it years later in interviews and claiming. Now, he wasn't the first to use it in English. It was first.
Let me stop you for just a second there on that thought you just had there, because I was connecting it in my mind with the fact that during the Korean War, one of the most alarming things that was bringing this to people's attentions were that there were televised interviews or statements being made by shot down prisoners of war from the United States, other Western nations. And they were flat out sitting there saying, I'm wrong, America's wrong, this whole thing is wrong, we are completely off the rails, and I make this statement freely of my own free will and this kind of thing. And people were like, what the hell is this? They had no idea why, you know, patriotic American military personnel would disappear and then reappear in this way. And this was the alarming thing. And do I understand it right that these statements about when it was being discussed or talked about preceded that?
He talked about brainwashing in that article, and that's before any American POW had made any statement.
Okay, it was. So got it.
It was opportunistic on his part. And to be fair, there was an international commission, which the Chinese didn't take part in, that looked into allegations made by the Chinese government and the North Korean government that biological warfare was being used, which was the main allegation. That allegation appears to be true. So those pilots were talking about dropping cluster bomb units that contain mosquitoes on North Korea. And you won't find anybody who is more concerned and distressed about the Chinese and the North Koreans than I am. I have nothing positive really to say, particularly about the Kim dynasty. But it's worth bearing in mind that not one North Korean town was left standing by 1953. North Korea was bombed flat. So in the same process that was tried in Vietnam afterwards, and it didn't work there either.
Right.
Hearts and minds and all that.
That's
but
right.
In fact, the term brainwashing was first used in English in January 1950 in the Times of India. And what had happened was that, the People's Republic of China was declared in October 49. That's about a year after India gains independence. And so the Premier of India, Nehru, sent his brother-in-law on a friendly mission to China. And when they came back, they reported how horrified they were by the way the Chinese were behaving. Particularly talked about the desperation of children in Chinese orphanages. And they came up with this word brainwashing. So nothing to do with Edward Hunter. That's it's a minor point, but I'm sick and tired of seeing it repeated as if it were truth. He talked with one guy who had some information about the thought reform camps, and that was the whole source for him. He did one interview.
Wow.
And published the book Brainwashing, and it was all sensational.
Right.
To trace it back, the Times of India was actually picking up the Chinese expression, and I think the Chinese have the right, if they wish, to name something. And the term that was used in Chinese is xinao, which means wash brain. Right. And it's a bit deeper than most Westerners see, because it's actually a comment about a Confucian idea, which is the cleansing of the heart.
Yeah, it has to do with purity.
Yes. Yeah. In those terms, it has existed for 2,500 years as a concept in China, that you can, by giving truthful and good information, you can change the heart, which the Chinese believe to be the organ of thought. We now know, of course, that the gut has almost as much to do with thinking as the rest of the neurons in us. As we have enough neurons to pretty much make a fist in our guts, and we don't know what it's doing, but we do know that our mood is more dependent on that than what's happening up here. More recently, we found out that serotonin and oxytocin don't do what we've been told. Authoritatively, they do. We don't know what they do anymore, frankly. But putting that aside,
yes, topic for another day.
For another day. Tune in later, and we'll tell you all about that. The Chinese communists were funded completely and entirely by Stalin. All of their money.
And this is where things get interesting. This is the part where things start connecting dots to Russia that I don't think a lot of people have really thought very much about.
No, it's really missed. I mean, at the same time, Stalin was also funding the Kuomintang, the nationalist government. He funded both sides in the Civil War, going, well, somebody's going to win.
Yeah. Guess I'll be on the winning side.
Yeah, and then along came the Japanese, which kind of messed things up a little bit. But and of course, Mao is not the original leader of the Chinese communists. He becomes the leader, I think, it's as late as the 1940s. He leads one of the armies, and he introduced, so his people are going and training in Russia, and they're picking up techniques that appear to have come from originally Ivan Pavlov.
Right, the bell conditioning thing.
Yeah, and I mean, all the stuff with the dogs and all of that, I didn't realize that Pavlov had also experimented on humans, and there is film. There's film of children, with their saliva being dripped out to beggar children. Awful stuff.
Yes,
it was said that he was the only man who could say whatever he wanted to Stalin, because Stalin revered him.
Now that's interesting. I wonder if that's true. That's a very interesting statement, because
it's true. There are enough witnesses to it that he could go and rage at Stalin, and Stalin would just take it all in. Anybody else, you're dead.
Right.
Quite simple. Or threatened, Shostakovich, they was told he'd written anti-Bolshevik music and would be sent to the Gulag if you did it again. I mean, how you tell whether your music's anti-Bolshevik or not, I'm not really sure. If anybody's got any suggestions, put them in the comments. But anti-Bolshevik sentiment is an invention of Mao, and Stalin gets it from him. Mao at one point executed a quarter of his army based on the fact that they were exhibiting anti-Bolshevik sentiment.
Wow.
Which is that they disagreed with him and his orders. And we here start to see some parallels with other authoritarian groups. If you have any critical or hostile thoughts about L. Ron Hubbard, then you are for the chop. You're going to be chucked out, overboarded, put on the rehabilitation project force or what have you.
That's right.
Now, of course, it's any recidivist thoughts about David Miscavige, any thought that David Miscavige is less than a messianic savior, is to be punished.
That's right. It's really not a matter of degrees of awful. It's a matter of there's this mind, there's this psychosis, there's this like predatory, type of person. I don't mean to draw them out as something non-human, because they are all too human. But they, if L. Ron Hubbard had more power, more influence, more, whatever, he easily could have gone in that direction. He easily could have started enacting his will through death, through violence, through, much worse means than he did. So it's, it's a point that needs to be
very lucky.
Yeah, it's a point that needs to be made,
And that was his intention. He intended to create a country, and he intended to rule it.
That's right.
And I think it was Malawi where they actually tried to buy land to set up a Scientology country. What a horrifying thought that is.
Yeah.
But so with the Chinese, Mao started to put forward a very simple idea, which is that you have the reason that the people are in trouble and things are not harmonious and they're not working properly is because they have a low consciousness, and you want to raise them to a higher consciousness. And the higher consciousness is the realization that society is divided into the people and the enemies, what we might call suppressive people.
Right, sort of an ultimate us versus them.
Yeah, and it led, a peak in the worst year of execution, it is said that Mao had 1.5 million people executed.
It's really hard to, it's just so hard to grok the scale. It's so hard,
You think about the, this is a statement attributed to Stalin. I'm told he didn't actually say it. And it's, the death of one man is a tragedy. The death of 1 million is a statistic. And apparently, just this last week, I can't remember who's meant to have said it. It was a Russian, and it was the death of one and the death of 100,000. He had slightly lower aims than Stalin in terms of genocide. Stalin is reckoned to have killed about 11 million, which, puts him in the big league. Mao is anywhere up to 70 million people died as a consequence.
Here it is.
Of Mao Zedong.
Yeah, the no proof Stalin ever said this, but even if he did, he would likely have been quoting a 1932 essay on French humor by the German journalist Kurt Tucholsky. Kurt Tucholsky.
Kurt Tucholsky.
That's where that
humorist. Isn't that a great place
and pacifist too, by the way.
Yeah.
Journalist, satirist, and pacifist is how he's labeled.
Good for him. I like him already. So basically what Mao got to, and this, for me, there's an echo here of existential therapy, the form devised by Rollo May, who made a very intelligent critique of Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. Mm-hmm. That's where I first read about him. But Rollo May's system of therapy was to say, look, you've come to see me, I'm a therapist, because your worldview isn't working. I will give you my worldview and you'll be fine. Existential crisis over. I see Mao, in that same kind of place, and I see Hubbard in that same kind of place. Mm-hmm. That they're advocating that the reason that the world isn't working is because you're not thinking straight.
There it is.
So
that's right.
With a higher, what happened was that through the 40s, while killing people for their anti-Bolshevik sentiment, Mao was also, along with one of his cadres, developing this program of re-education, which continues to this day. We've seen it in the Xinjiang camps. Mm. And the idea is that, say what they did about 200,000 people had been through this program before the People's Republic is declared in October 49. So it's already being tried out. And what you're having
Russia?
Is in China, 200,000.
Okay, so they've already done a pilot program, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of people have been through, and it would take a few weeks. And then they rounded up all of the members of the River Lakes societies in China. China's a different place to everywhere else. The River Lakes there are 3 hierarchies of itinerant people. And in each of the hierarchies, there are 3 classes. And this includes prostitutes, beggars, thieves, con artists, sorcerers, itinerant doctors, and itinerant philosophers. Of course, China has a long tradition of people who go around solving problems intellectually, but pretty much like the sophists in classical Greece. They're all classed and they're all rounded up, starting in Beijing. So they go to the houses of ill virtue, and the prostitutes are people who are put in one set of camps, and the brothel keepers are enemies. Very few enemies survived the camps they were put into, but they're separated out at that point.
So there's 2 classes of camps.
Yeah.
Okay. That's important to know about.
Yeah, I think so. And you've been judged from the start. If you are held to be an enemy, then you are pretty much considered to be beyond reform. Right. So This is like with Scientology, where they'll declare somebody a suppressive person and throw them out, or they'll put them onto we're told the rehabilitation project force isn't there anymore. Who knows?
Well, I tell you, the first thing that comes to my mind is Jews being rounded up to concentration camps as well, because it's the same kind of prejudgment with no absolution possible.
And let's add that all the Romanists were also rounded up.
That's right.
Blacks were rounded up. Communists were rounded up.
Yep.
After the Wannsee Conference in 42, they're exterminated, though on the way into Eastern Europe. There's a horrifying movie about Belarusia called Come and See, where you find out what happened there, that Jews were packed into barns, which were then set on fire, and there were machine guns placed around in case anybody tried to escape.
Jesus.
Terrible, awful things.
Jesus. And so basically we find out China was doing the same damn thing with its own thing, with its own twist.
And when you read about, gradually as the camps it was basically thought that the education program had worked, and it moved on to that if when you studied at college, so in mid 1950s onwards, part of your education would be to go to the struggle meetings where a landlord or a profiteer would be abused verbally, then abused physically, and then killed. And students were expected to take part not only in the verbal abuse, but also in the physical attacks upon these people, who would be cut to ribbons sometimes.
It's a twisted kind of genius, because it puts people into a frame of mind who've gone through something like that where they can't ever go back.
Yeah.
They witnessed somebody get killed because of this. They participated in it. You don't come back from that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I can't think of a better way to solidify a state of mind than with a human death involved that you had your hands involved in, Wow. I never heard about that before. That's awful.
Yes. I mean, when the Green Berets in the School of the Americas were training Contra-Revolución Sandinistas, to fight against the Sandinistas, there's a standard, and this is horrifying. It's really horrifying to live in a world where this has happened and not enough has been done about it.
Yeah.
But they would say, is there anybody in the room who disapproves of torture? And somebody would put their hand up, and that's a bad mistake, because they then torture them.
Oh, wow.
So you're pulled into the process and you become guilty, as you say. So, we have obedience trained into us. We have groupthink where we agree with what's going on around us. And then there are the specific things you can do to somebody that will make them less likely to protest and more likely to comply.
Right.
And, at the moment in Russia, if you say that there's a war in Ukraine, that's a criminal offense and you're sent to prison for saying it. That could make you kind of bite your tongue a little bit,
Yeah, exactly. We talk about group pressure and peer pressure and social pressures. I talk about it a lot, the power of it, the influence of it on us. But, these extreme situations really demonstrate the point. You're in a room with people with guns and they start talking about things you need to do and comply with, and there are no choices anymore. I mean, it's intense. And that kind of thing is the sort of stuff that the later social pressures are built on. They don't have to do that twice. They do it once and they're done, It's that kind of thing.
I talked with somebody today who was in China for 6 years, and she said that what would happen is that people would have an app on their phone and it would tell them that pollution levels were low today. And she'd say, but look out of the window. And the Chinese person she was talking to said, no, look, they're down. But you can't see through the smog. And that's, of course, what Robert J. Lifton called ideology over experience, or doctrine over person.
That's right.
I think one of the worst things I've ever seen is a documentary called One Child Nation.
Yes, it was horrifying, that one. Yeah. Yes.
And it's an incredible Chinese woman who emigrated, had a baby, went back to China a few years later, and she interviews people. The one-child policy is just about lifted at this time. It's not so long ago. And you find, once you've had a baby, you're told you will now be, your tubes will be tied. You'll have tubal ligation. And if you refuse, then it will be done forcibly. And women would be wrapped in sleeping bags, tied up, taken to the hospital. And the amazing thing in the documentary is that she actually talks to people who've had this done to them. And they say, but it was necessary for the success of China.
That's right. And the perpetrators as well. Both sides. Like, nope, it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. And the reality we now know about population growth, that once a population is reasonably well fed and cared for, the breeding rates go down.
Mm-hmm.
And that, we now have less than an equal birth rate in much of the West for that very reason. But, you don't want to have 15 kids. It's just, whoa,
well, it's
too much.
At this point as well, for the average American, and I'm positive for the average Brit, it's just financially untenable. You just can't afford it. We can barely afford a dog, much less a family of kids. I mean, it's not for lack of desire either, you know. So these things feed each other in ways that are really not that hard to connect these dots. They're not that far apart, really. Yeah. What's going on in China? What we're talking about here between Russia and China and this evolution of brainwashing has spread around the world. I mean, it's not like America's hands are clean on this, or Britain's for that matter. And and it's not about guilt. I'm just trying to talk about awareness here. It's like these things cause other things to happen, like the Chinese population decline that we are seeing right now that is affecting every single one of us because so much manufacturing is done over there. This is all connected. Just want to make that point.
Yeah, and we're going to see India overtake China in terms of population probably in the next year or two. A country that's profoundly unstable, that's failed utterly to modernize, and is now becoming a leading economy where, again, the political influence there, where you have gurus like Sai Baba was an advisor to government, this trickster. But we also, of course, have the Hindu Nazism as a real problem in our society, where there's this overlap where ideas are being seeping into the Indian consciousness and leading to fundamentally anti-human beliefs, which wherever they rise. So the idea that Muslims don't deserve to live, which we've seen a lot of murders in India.
Yes.
Of course, we've got terrible problems with gang rape there, which are not being solved.
Yeah.
And so you have societies
and then in the Muslim communities, you have honor killings. I mean, it's it's bad on both ends. It's not that these people deserve to die. I'm just saying, the awful spreads. It's just
and there is a division in all of the religious groups between the kind of fervent fundamentalist zealots who you will find in any group.
Yep.
So in Islam, you have Salafis, Wahhabis, out of whom came both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And they make up something like 0.5% of the Muslim population. But, I mean, when here, our 7th of July bombing back in, 2005 or whenever, that a close friend of mine said to me, Muslims should apologize for having done this. And I said, so should Christians apologize for Waco? What on earth does it have to do with the Muslim community that half a dozen nutcases who have been steeped in a perversion of the Muslim teaching, because, suicide bombing definitely is not something that is allowed within the Quran.
Right. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? This extremist small percentage becoming this oversized influence because of social media and news media, bullhorn effect. And people get really distorted ideas about just how big of a threat it is, in the same way that QAnon, this crazy tiny little group of people who have an awful lot of similar beliefs to a lot of the stuff we're talking about, by the way, except they've got it all twisted around in their mind that they're the good guys, and so all this killing that they want to do is all good and righteous. It's really crazy making stuff, but it's a tiny, tiny group of people who have an outsized influence because of the nature of our media and the way our brains work, where we're focused more on the threats than we do on the benefits of society and life around us. And so it becomes oversized in our own brain. But I'm not saying these are not threats. I'm saying that they are very valid threats, but I'm just trying to talk about proportionality here.
Yeah, which I think is really important.
Yeah.
If we look at the influence that Scientology has had on the world.
Yeah.
That from Bill Clinton onwards, one president after another has had the State Department criticize Germany for refusing to give jobs to Scientologists who are, by their profession of religion, spies. They will report to Scientology. You're meant to. The responsibilities of leaders, the Simon Bolivar policy. Any Scientologist is expected to have a loyalty first. Now, we can ask questions about the loyalty of people to other, faith groups as well, and we probably should.
Yeah.
But Scientology is a tiny, tiny organization. It's never, David Gaiman started this notion in the 60s of there were 5 million Scientologists. And a friend of mine asked him, how did you come up with that number? And he said, well, I'm sure that by now that many people have done auditing.
Yes.
And that was it.
That's it. That's right. They just made it up. And
then
it became,
every year after that, it was 11 million in one place.
Yeah. They had to, every year after, I've seen 20 million. They had to add another million every year. They just arbitrarily threw another million on the fire.
Well, as you're the fastest growing religion in the world, you have to grow. Yeah. And, it took me a long time to realize they're actually counting all the little body thetans. That's what it is. And there are probably now, about 20,000 members of the International Association of Scientologists, yet Richard Dawkins has called it a major religion. Amazon recognizes it as a religion. And you're sort of going, it's like a bullfrog, isn't it? It makes a big noise.
That's right. That's right.
And therefore, it's, we see so many people have just backed away because they're frightened of what it might, of what it might do to them. And then you go, it's insignificant if we stand up to it. And if we understand that the people involved with it are victims.
Yes.
They're not perpetrators. Correct. They are the people. They are not the enemy. David Miscavige, on the other hand, I fear to say, is the enemy. Though if he'd like to come around and have a cup of tea and promises not to shout at me, I'd love to meet him. I met his brother Ronnie. I met his dad, and they were great. They were really wonderful people. Yes. So I'm sure even he can be saved. But he doesn't seem to be working very hard at it at the moment.
No.
The aspect of, re-education camps, the first part is to tell people what the higher consciousness is. And that is, everything is for the people. There's a story where a former prostitute won't respond to questions. And eventually her interrogator becomes exasperated. And she finally talks. And she said, the reason that I'm a prostitute, the reason that my life is absolutely dreadful is my karma. I deserve it. It's my fate. And that's the lower consciousness. And they're trying to replace that with a consciousness which says, no, you're the victim of exploitation. So at this point, all we can do is agree with them, really, that that's right. But what they're going to replace this with, slavish devotion to a dictator in the name of democratic communism, a little bit of a contradiction in terms there. It's kind of,
and
what would Ron do?
And that's that language nonsense. See, here's the trap. Here's what they do. I've seen this so many goddamn times. You're in a bad place. You're being abused, you're being traumatized, you've got trauma, you've got financial problems, you've got issues, whatever. You're in a bad place, you're in a bad place, you don't feel good. Somebody comes and says to you, hey man, you're in a bad place. You don't deserve this. This isn't right. And you go, yeah, that's right. And they go, yeah, that's right. And then...
And it's going to get worse.
Yeah, and then here's the problem with predators is they'll say all the right things and then present you a solution that uses all the right language, but the actions, the method, what they do to you is just enslave you even harder. It's crazy making how successful that can be,
And has been. I mean, the history of humanity is the history of tyranny. If we go back generation by generation, we live in the best times there have ever been. Now, whether our children will have that benefit, we now have to rather doubt. But we live at the most incredible time in terms of being fed, in terms of having entertainment and, our working hours, our working conditions. If we look back 150 years to the 1870s, we have a situation in this country and in the US where 4-year-old children were being sent up chimneys to clean them, down mines to bring things out. There was no such thing as childhood. It's an invention of somewhere around the 1860s, around the time of Alice in Wonderland, where the children of the 10% who form the middle class will now have this idyllic childhood. The majority of children will be working from, as soon as they can, as soon as their little hands can do anything. So we live in this great time. Looking back, in school, I was, of course, English school, I was taught about all of the great kings and queens. We'd had good Queen Bess, who spent, actually, I later find, more time with her chief torturer than any other official of her court. Not quite as good as I was told when I was a kid, She introduced the penalty of execution if you displayed the wrong portrait of her.
Wow.
That might be reasonable, Her dad, after all, had wrecked and destroyed most of the country to grab wealth and was a horrific monster. Her brother Edward was, as a king, founded the school I went to, actually. The school I walked out of when I was 14. But so, about 1560 or something, he started this school, and the same people were still teaching there when I was there. Awful place. But they, he was a religious fanatic and they start burning one another. And, oh, you're a Catholic, we're going to burn you. Oh, you're a Protestant, we're going to burn you. We get witches being persecuted. We have lived through generation after generation of horror. And the reason we've lived through it is because we've been ruled by tyrants.
Yep.
Sadistic, monstrous tyrants.
That's right.
And that continues right through history. I could be nasty about Queen Victoria too if I felt like it. But
well, I just wish people would. I just wish people would understand that all the layers of bureaucracy and the balance of powers, the division of power that we see in countries like the UK or the US, while not perfect systems, I really wish people would understand that the purpose of those systems is to distribute the power in such a way that no one person can fuck everything up. And that seems to have been missed uniformly across the boards in every ideological conversation I see on social media these days. Tear it all down, tear it all down. It's all bad. It's all the systems of oppression that are destroying us. I want to slap these people. It's the systems that are keeping you safe from the tyranny that one man or one woman will absolutely engage in if given the chance. You just don't understand that these systems are important, and I'm not saying they're perfect. They are flawed beyond belief. They evolve into monstrous things. We see the movie Brazil. Yeah, bureaucracies can get insane. They can become extreme too. So let's not go there, but let's not pretend that these systems have no function or purpose. They protect us. That's the whole point. I got to get on that soapbox every now and again because it just really riles me up when I see revolutionists, we're extreme left-wing people talking about tear down the system, because the system is the thing that's wrong. And you're like, I wish you'd take a different look at this,
Yeah, have a little bit of a look at history. And, Santayana and his, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat what they should have learned. Exactly. It was above Jim Jones' throne at Jonestown.
Exactly.
So I had a few 20 years ago, I visited a house that was one of the few remaining 14th century knights' houses. And you'd expect something quite grand. It wasn't. But the thing that was really interesting, no staircase, it was quite a small stone building in the south of England, which has somehow survived and become this tiny little museum. And what interested me particularly was that you would get up to the upper floor on a ladder so that the ladder could be pulled up and the trapdoor put down when thieves and brigands came around to steal your stuff. And this is something, it goes back to the Viking invasions where, people learned that, and then the Vikings would set fire to the room below.
Yeah, exactly.
Not very nice. But realizing that, that there was no police force until, 18th, really only properly established in the 19th century.
Yep.
And while one absolutely supports the imprisonment of Derek Chauvin and, any investigation into corruption and brutality, we at the moment in our London Metropolitan Police, every 10 years, about 10% of the force is dismissed because they're corrupt. So it's a problem, and it's one, there need to be independent bodies that are dealing with this.
Yep.
You cannot trust, any group or organization not to become a cult if they, are allowed to make rulings about their own evil doings.
That's right.
We had a guy a policeman who investigated the shoot to kill policy by the Royal Ulster Constabulary in Ireland. And he was thrown out of the police when he said, yeah, they are deliberately killing people. It's the famous Gibraltar shooting.
Well, we certainly have parallels with that here in the US right now.
Yeah. And so while I think it's absolutely dreadful that about one unarmed black person a month is killed by a police officer in the United States, yep. I think it's really scary that under surveys, people think that number is in the thousands, where it's about 10 or 12 a year. That's deplorable. It should not be happening.
That's right.
But it's exaggerated in the public consciousness, and you then get this idea, that if we just destroy everything, human beings will be fine and virtuous. Well, exactly. I don't believe in that. That's not my experience.
We just have to return to the forest or something, or the jungle. It's like, no, it's madhouse. That's crazy. But it's another demonstration of that outsized influence of, really awful stuff grabs our attention and focuses our attention and keeps it there. And it's hard to tear it away, and you start cogitating on the size of the problem, and it becomes oversized in your mind. And that's where we lose perspective. And if there's anything critical thinking is for, it's for maintaining perspective.
Yeah, look at evidence and balance the evidence out.
Exactly.
I mean, the next part of the Chinese thought reform, once you've told people they're the enemy, you're the victim, you've been exploited, fair enough. And it's not your fault, if you remember Good Will Hunting. It's not your fault.
And it was true.
So the next stage in the original program, which was launched in Beijing in early 1950, is self-criticism. And that's what led to our conversation, because I want you to talk about the truth rundown.
Yes.
And what happens is that you create a situation where you tell people they can openly criticize others, and you make careful notes, and they may then, be fine, say whatever you like. But of course, if you say anything that puts you in the enemy camp, you'll be executed. Oh, a little bit of a slip there. But self-criticism becomes really important. Now, but we'll get to struggle sessions, which is the third and last part afterwards.
Yeah.
You teach people to say, I'm wrong. I'm in the wrong. It is because of my wrong worldview that I have come to this place, and I am now transforming my worldview. And this is really pushed forward. Now, self-criticism will always and must always lead to absolute agreement with the thoughts of Chairman Mao in this case, or the thoughts of Chairman Ron in Scientology.
Yep.
That it is unthinkable that Ron Hubbard could be wrong. Even when he contradicts himself on every other page, it's unthinkable that he could be wrong. And so this self-criticism, this idea, Mike Rinder's book, I think, is a wonderful example of it. And you've talked often enough about it too, that where something fails in the system, Scientological system, where something does not work, you will blame yourself.
Yep.
If anything good happens to you, you will thank the system. You will thank Ron. I mean, reading Jefferson Hawkins' Counterfeit Dreams, wonderful book. He basically got Dianetics, the mental science of modern health, back on the bestseller list 40 years after it was written, and it's a rubbish book. It's one of the most atrocious diatribes I've ever read.
I really don't know if people get what an unsung marketing genius Jeff Hawkins was in making
and I wish he'd come and work for me.
Right.
But he explains that he had to push aside everything that Hubbard had taught about marketing because it was nonsense and it didn't work. And he managed to get something that did work. I mean, what they were doing was sponsoring a car in the NASCAR.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, they were doing anything they could to generate goodwill, and some of it worked, and some of it was a total fucking disaster.
Yeah, I mean, they managed to scare Hill and Knowlton off. You know, the same year that Hill and Knowlton made up the stories about babies being pitched out of incubators in Kuwait City by Iraqi troops, they admitted later they'd taken the 15-year-old daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, and she was actually shopping in New York the day that she claimed to have been watching Iraqi soldiers. Completely falsified. Baby stories are so good for starting wars.
Yep.
And yet they were quite willing to do that, but they weren't willing to work for Scientology, and Scientology sued them. I ended up having a bizarre conversation with this man, Martin Sorrell. And because I am such an unworldly type, I had no idea that he was one of the most powerful men in the world. And he said, well, what should we do about this Scientology thing with Hill and Knowlton? And I'm like, pay them off, frankly. If you want the trouble, you know. I didn't even charge for the conversation. I am such a fool, you know. I saved them millions. Same with Eli Lilly. I had a 15-minute conversation that said, pay them off.
Good advice in terms of ending the trouble for them.
Yeah, not in terms of trouble for me, though. I didn't get paid on either occasion.
I know.
Oh, well.
Oh, well.
So,
yes, in terms of...
this thing of self-criticism, you are in the wrong.
That's right.
The first time that I learned about the Truth Rundown was in June 2015 in Toronto, when you got up at the stage, and I think it was something like your third public appearance.
Yeah, I hadn't done a lot at that point.
Isn't that cute?
Yeah.
And you were great. You're such a natural. You really are.
Thank you.
You got up on the stage and you told us about the Truth Rundown. And I know so much about Scientology, but I was flabbergasted at this last step of a thought reform program. So tell our kind audience.
Yeah, let's talk about it. You have a what we're talking about here is how do you get people to go along with your program? Well, the single best way to do it is to introvert them and get them thinking it's all their fault, as we've discussed here. So how do you do that? Well, in Scientology, you have a spectrum. You have a gradual series of steps you can do. It doesn't start with the heavy. It starts with, oh, well, maybe you have committed some overts that are causing you to perceive things a little differently than you should be. Because, when you commit,
is being ruined because of your transgressions.
Exactly. Yeah. And
you're not seeing clearly. You're not seeing clearly.
That's right. And so we're going to help you. We're going to assist you to see more clearly by having you sit in a room with a ream of paper and writing down all of your overts and withholds, all of your civilized acts, you could say, all the things you've been doing that are bad and wrong and you wouldn't want to confess to in a public forum, right? Those are the things you're going to write down. And we're going to get all the specifics on that, but that's really not very important. What's important is that you take responsibility for the bad things you have done so that you can see things clearly.
We will keep the little write-up you did, just in case, but it's your own good.
We're just going to file this away in this little folder that has your name on it. Don't worry about it. It's all good. It's in the closet. It says confidential on it. Don't worry about it. And so,
let me interject at this point that one of the first people I interviewed after I left in 1983 was an ethics officer from St. Hill. And he was talking about how they pass these things around among themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever sexual transgressions particularly would be. And he going, and we're being told this is absolutely confidential.
Oh, yeah. No. Really? No, we used to, I can say I have participated in such activities. Absolutely.
Oh, so you've committed overts of that type?
I have. I was not a great guy when I was in Scientology. Now
you are now, though, Chris. So you've made up for it.
I'm working on it. Okay, now we go from that, which most people will very easily agree with, because people are hyper aware of their bad spots, their weaknesses, where they do things wrong, when they have violated their own moral foundations. They're hyper aware of that, right? Because they're judging themselves constantly. And that's part of the process of living. There's nothing unusual about that. You can exaggerate it beyond all bounds, and that's bad. And people should get therapy for that. But it's a perfectly organic process that we review our actions constantly, judge ourselves, try to do better. So it's very easy to get in there on that line on guilt and sort of pump that a little bit. And people go, oh yeah, no, I agree with that. I could see that. And as long as they're not defensive, as long as you've got them in a calm place where they're willing to be, they trust you, they think there's a line here that's going to work, they'll fall for it. So that goes from OW write-ups, so overt withhold write-ups, to security checking, which is the next grade up from that, where, okay, we happen to think that there might be overts and withholds you've committed that are badly affecting your perceptions and abilities, and even your OT power, right? This is how you reduce yourself spiritually, is you commit bad acts, and that's what causes you to pull the flippers in, and you're not really as cause, and you're not really willing to go look at those areas you've committed overts in. You're not really willing to go talk to your mom anymore because of all the overts you've committed against her. So we're going to do what's called a security check or a confessional, and we're going to use
integrity
this here e-meter
processing.
That's right.
Integrity processing.
Integrity processing. Yes. That was an older term for it. And we're going to use an e-meter. And now we're going to use this device to discern the truth. And we're going to get you to confess to us. Even the things you forgot about, we're going to dig them up. We're going to find them. And we're going to get it all out in the open.
We're only interested in this lifetime, in this instance.
Yes, we are.
Only the stuff that can be used against you, because what you did in the other 1.25 quadrillion years doesn't really matter.
Nah, not that important.
We can't embarrass you with it, you know?
Exactly. So we might go back and get that stuff. And actually, here's where that script flips. Because that does flip. And the security checks are done for the present time stuff. And you can go past life, but the reports that get written, and reports do get written after these confessional sessions, detailing the crimes that you have confessed to, and this all goes in those files again, right? Don't worry about the files, confidential, it's all good, no need to worry about any of that. So they tell you, right? And then there's the truth rundown. Now this is the ultimate in gaslighting, in memory manipulation. This is not just abusive forms of confessional. At the highest, I guess you could say, levels of the confession culture, you start rewriting people's memories. Because they have to, sorry, I got mildly distracted there. They have to get you to think that all the bad things that they've done to you were all your fault. That karma thing. Right? Oh, it's karma. It's my karma. That's why all these bad things are happening to you. Except it's not random life circumstances. It's actual authoritarian abuse that's being rained down on you. Like in Scientology, David Miscavige beats the shit out of some guy. And then
they've got to then go away and find out why they forced him to do that.
That's right. That's right. You then go into a truth rundown session where you are, and we don't have to get into the whole procedure. I already did a whole video breaking all that down. The point is that part of the process is not just pulling your criminal acts, it's focusing your attention on what is it you're complaining about or having a problem with or finding fault with in this system or situation, taking that complaint and saying the reason you have that, the only reason that you are even finding fault with David Miscavige right now for beating the shit out of you is because of your own crimes against David Miscavige, see? Because the truth is, and this is where reality goes over the cliff, okay? This is truly crazy-making material. Is they'll tell you, and you will be coerced and sec-checked and pushed and manipulated into believing, oh, he never beat up on me. I'm the one who beat up on somebody. And you will literally rewrite your own memories. I have watched it happen right in front of me. I not only received a truth rundown where this was done to me, but I have delivered it on 2 other people when I was on the RPF. And this is a super secret super confidential action in Scientology. People know way more about the OT levels than they know about the Truth Rundown. And the reason is the Truth Rundown has never leaked. Nobody's ever taken the couple issues out of the church, so I had to describe them, and Bruce Hines also did a rundown on it. We're the only ones who have actually ever described what the actual rundown consists of, and it is a step-by-step process of professional grade, I could say military grade, gaslighting. And you don't come out the other side of that truth rundown. You are not allowed to until here's the end result, that actually written down by L. Ron Hubbard. You're not done until you, of your own free will, on your own bat, with no hint or suggestion from anybody else, decide, you know what? I have been such an evil schmuck for so long. I have done all these horrible things to these people that I was complaining about. I owe them a public apology. I need to write an apology to David Miscavige, the guy who beat the shit out of me, because he never beat the shit out of me. I'm the one who did that to all these people. I'm now taking responsibility for what I have done and apologizing publicly for my gross misperception and complaints and fault finding of David Miscavige. And you have to write this and send it to every single person you complained about or complained to. Right? I was a liar. I was a scumbag. I had no idea what I was talking about. This is the kind of, similar to those televised things from the prisoners of war. It's a total reversal of actual reality. But the person who is doing it, and believe me, I have literally done this. I've been in this headspace. It's the exact opposite of reality. But you believe it to your core. And I can't tell you how long it takes, because it takes a while. It's different for each person. But it takes a long damn time to come back from that.
Yeah.
A long time. Because it's deep, it's diving deep into the brain, right? When you're rewriting memory and convincing yourself by going over it and over it and over it again, which is part of the process. And then having to write of your own accord, confessions and apologies, it solidifies it. It puts it in place with a gold seal. That's what happened as far as you're concerned. I've never seen or heard, short of full on waterboarding and the kind of stuff they get up to it, unfortunately, in Guantanamo and other places. Short of that, I've never seen anything more effective at rewriting people's memories than a truth rundown. Well,
and to be fair, the incredible movie, The Report, which shows that in fact in Guantanamo Bay, and it wasn't really waterboarding, they were half semi-drowning people. Yeah. Waterboarding is a wet towel and a technique invented by the Spanish Inquisition.
Oh, was it?
Would you believe? Yep, used in the 17th century by the Spanish Inquisition. But they would just put a wet towel over you. What was happening at Gitmo was they were pouring water through the towel. But it's, as the torture report shows, not one accurate confession was ever achieved by this method.
Not one.
So it's an absurd and perverse method, of undermining somebody. But in that environment of hostility, you don't actually get transformation. As Robert J. Lifton shows in Thought Reform in Modern China, that writing your confession, that's an essential aspect of the thought reform process, that you will keep being asked to sign confessions in the camps. This was particularly so for the intellectuals, where you will be admitting things that you didn't do.
Exactly.
And gradually over a period, the original internees would spend a few weeks in the program, and the program got longer and longer. And we've got, I think it was somebody who was 5 years in this program.
Wow.
And one of the reasons that brainwashing is dismissed by some academics who've not studied it thoroughly enough is because, Lifton interviewed 25 people and 24 of them didn't believe in any of the re-education anymore, so therefore it doesn't work.
And that's where they lose the plot 100% of the time. I'm glad you're bringing this up.
Yeah, because the reality is that if you take the person out of the reinforcing environment, the milieu, and as we saw with One Child Nation, the Chinese people believe, at the moment, it's almost impossible to believe, but most Russians believe that Vladimir Zelensky is a Nazi as well as a Jew. We have stories of Russian soldiers torturing people in Ukraine to find out, where the Nazis are, and they kind of go, "There aren't any. You're the Nazis. What are you doing?"
That's right.
I mean,
because you set up a situation where it becomes impossible to agree with reality and answer the questions.
Yeah.
And so you have to reform your memories. I mean, if you're stuck in a room where somebody's not going to let you out until you say what they want you to say, which is basically what we're talking about here, you're going to comply because you want to get the hell out of that room. And if they're a barrier that you can't get past, you have to cooperate. And that's
if
the
you
situation,
don't show the right emotional response, you're just going to, in the camps, those who were just about to be released had one task, which was the third aspect of the program, which is the thought struggle, so somebody new comes in and there are 7 or 8 people in the cell they're in, and those people will then scream abuse at the new person. And when that person has gone through the first stage of breakdown and signed their first confession, the other people in the room can go home.
Right.
That you won't be let out until you've participated. And what we were saying about collaboration before, you create a whole society. One of the most horrifying things, it said that Voltaire was the first person to publicly complain that torture was being used as part of the judicial process. And it is very easy for those who want to tear down the system to believe that everything will be lovely if we do that.
Yep.
But if you look back at the judicial process over centuries in Europe, then hanging, drawing, and quartering was a usual way of punishing a criminal. So they would be paraded out. And here's a piece of advice. If you want to travel back in time and get arrested as a criminal, make sure your execution is midwinter, because you'll be dragged out at dawn. And at that point, you'll be hanged, not until you're dead, but until you're very upset, right? Publicly. Then you will be drawn. Your entrails will be pulled out of you and burned in front of you. You will still be alive at this point. This is part of justice in the European system. And similar things have happened in Asia and Africa, in Australia, wherever you go.
Yeah,
viciousness has occurred.
If I might just
the idea was to stretch this out through the whole day. So that's why I'm saying, if you do travel through a wormhole in time. Yeah. But this was normal. And so the idea of public execution, the idea of watching people would, they'd be selling hot potatoes. And
this was entertainment for people.
Yeah. We now have YouTube, so we don't have to do this anymore.
That's right.
We can instead watch people driving Lamborghinis into swimming pools and
let's not pretend by the way that civilization has changed all of this, because it was only about up until 100 years ago, in 1923, if you had been taken in by the cops anywhere in the United States, they were within their rights to beat a confession out of you.
The third degree.
That's right. It was a thing. It was not a joke. It was a thing. And that's what they would do to you, because they knew you were guilty and they just wanted you to confess.
Yeah.
That was how policing was done until about 100 years ago.
Well, and the revision of the criminal justice bill in this country, I think in 1988, basically meant that all police interviews now have to be recorded.
Right.
And if you go back to the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, people who were sent to prison, in the name of the Father with Daniel Day-Lewis is a remarkably accurate account of these poor people who went to prison because they confessed. And when you find out how they were brutalized by British police officers, and we're talking the 1970s here, it's unbelievable. It's like, but you confessed. And the only other evidence against them was that there was gunpowder residue on their hands. And it was later found out that the playing cards that they'd been using contained a chemical that you got a false positive on that test for. So we're not through it yet. We are a lot closer. When the British police introduced body cams, complaints against the police dropped by more than 90%.
Yep. Same here in the US, I believe.
We have to monitor. We have to be careful.
That's right.
But yeah, to think that everybody will be nice to each other, we need laws and we need systems that look at corruption. I personally would like to see something done about plutocracy as well. The idea that you can buy a politician by giving money to their campaign fund, that really bothers me.
Me too.
So there's this kind of overlap that the more I look at what Hubbard did and the more I look at what the Chinese communists were doing, the more I see is similar. And whether it's similar because Hubbard studied these things, and I think he probably did, I think the Rehabilitation Project Force, I think he probably read Lifton, either when he was in Queens at the end of 72, beginning of 73, or a little bit afterwards. And I think that he designed a program deliberately. It may well be that he just read Edward Hunter's Brainwashing, because that's more the kind of research that Hubbard did. He'd pick up the Reader's Digest and find out some wisdom about penicillin from it that he could then share with us.
Yeah, exactly. I'd be surprised if he could make it through Lifton.
Yeah,
it's pretty academic.
The other thing is that when the Phoenix Lectures was made, there's a story about a Scientologist who died and left this collection of mystical literature, and that Hubbard asked somebody to go and look through this stuff and see if any of it was useful, and they reported back to him, and he was then able to make a few little comments in his lectures that made it sound as if he'd read, the Hymn to the Dawn Child or the Rig Veda, or what he calls the Tao Te King, King, which is, of course, Aleister Crowley's misspelling of Jing, and quite unusual. But it's mysticism light. It's, he was not he had such a bad, such a short attention span. And this is something that people really don't get about this man. He wrote one book, Dianetics, The Mental Science of Modern Health. Every other book, and I think there were 27, I count, every other book was a compilation written by somebody else. He didn't, he wrote Battlefield
or dictated.
Well,
he
he
dictated quite a few books. I mean, there was Problems of Work, Dynamics 55, Science of Survival.
They're compilations. Science is, you see, they're compilations in that he did not say, this is the beginning of the book, go through this. When Richard DeMille put together those little green discs for Science of Survival, he had to organize the material and put it together.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
When we look at, say, Fundamentals of Thought and Problems of Work, there are pieces in there that had previously been published.
Yes. And
we then find, if we go back, say, to the Professional Auditors Bulletins of the 1950s, that the names of the authors have been taken off them.
Yep.
For example, one of the significant authors of Scientology material was Paul Twitchell, the founder of Eckankar, which is a fairy story, quite literally, about all the little elves in our gardens and stuff. Twitchell wrote Hubbard material. L. Ron Hubbard Jr. had the junior taken off the upper indoctrination training routines and various other things.
That's right.
Hubbard
and Mary Sue wrote a bunch of policies too, by the way, as did other aides and staff of Hubbard, but they were all given L. Ron Hubbard signatories.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
So we have a situation where it's, and I think that's because his attention span was so short. The only other professional writer I know of, and I'm sure in the comments people can add others, but the only one I know of is Ryder Haggard, who never made a second draft. Hubbard
yeah,
just was so bored with what he'd already said.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think I noticed that, and I think I get what you're saying, and I think you're right with that. I would say that Hubbard was rather, what's the word, bipolar. In that he had their stories, right, of when he was a professional writer, and he was a professional writer, that he would stay up all night, just bang them out, get 3 stories done or something, bang them all out, and then you'd see him in a malaise for days, where he wouldn't really do much, and then he would have this hyper frenetic short burst period of time where he would get a lot of work done. I think I think that's what he brought into his methods of how he worked as the Scientology guy too.
Yeah, and he harnessed the people around him. So you have the January 1949 letter from Savannah, Georgia, to his agent, Forry Ackerman. Mm-hmm. And Forry shared all of his letters with me long ago, bless him. And
a real treasure trove.
In it, his letters and Helen O'Brien's collection of letters, who ran the Philadelphia doctorate course, remarkable what you find in there. But in that letter, the one where he says you can rape women without them knowing about it, all of this money can be made. We find him saying that Sarah is writing the stories. So the stories that will be published under one of his pseudonyms are actually being written by his second and bigamous wife.
Oh, I'd have to look at that again. I missed that part. Wow. Yeah. Wow, this guy.
Yeah. And I think, he's the thing you've got to say about Ron Hubbard, it is black or white. It's, he is either the savior of humanity or he was a very naughty boy.
I'll go with the latter. Knowing what I know about the guy.
And as you look at it, he is refining and developing ways of imprisoning people, of enslaving people. And he's, he gets worse and worse with time. The more power he has, the more corrupt he becomes. The things he starts to do in 1968 on the ship, there's no precedent for them.
That's right.
That people who were around him in the mid-60s, like John McMaster and Otto Rose and Hannah Whitfield, and so many people I've talked with over the years at some length, he was not that evil tyrant until he got his own ship and his own little group of his own little flotilla. And then he starts doing the most dreadful things to people. Then you have the period, say, at La Quinta, 1977, where whatever happened, he spent all of that time and effort, all of that money, making the tech films. Where are they? Why did they all disappear? I mean, the one I remember, and the only one I can remember seeing, was one with David Mayo in.
Oh, really? That was the only one you ever saw?
Yeah, they really didn't travel. Well, see, I was way up the bridge by then. I wasn't going to watch this beginning level stuff.
Well, right. Plus, you didn't do auditor training, right?
I did do auditor training.
You did?
Yeah, I did six. Yeah, I've heard this so often about myself that, I did the HQS, the Dianetics course, the Method 1 course, the Class 0 course, the Class 1 course, and the Class 2 course.
Okay, so on Class 0,
what
1,
the Romans
and 2,
ever done for us?
There should have been some films, but what year did you do them?
Oh, it's before the films were released.
Oh, okay, got it. So you never got to see them.
Released.
Okay. Sorry, just clarifying.
But the one I did see had a very awkward David Mayo, who quite evidently wasn't much of an actor, in a kind of sharp 1950s suit with a trilby on. And the line I remember, because of course at this time he was touted to be, he was the heir. He was going to take over from Hubbard. We all knew that in 1978 or whenever. And there's this strange little line at the end of it where he says, now, of course, if this film gets lost, you'll know what happened. We've been taken over. And that kind of stuck in my mind when Story of a Squirrel came out in 1982, attacking him. But yeah, we have here, our friend Christian Churko when he was asked a few years ago what book he gives to people who are thinking about leaving a group or have just left a group, and he's dealt with somewhere over 3,000 people over the years.
Yeah.
I don't think he has any rival in terms of numbers. Incredible man.
Mm-hmm.
But to my amazement, he said that he gave them My Scientology Cult of Greed. I'm like, well, people coming out of the Jehovah's Witnesses or the 12 Tribes or Nichiren, you give them all this book. Why do you do that? He said, oh, well, Scientology does everything. And anybody who's been in an extreme authoritarian sect will recognize some aspect of what happened to them in Scientology. And it's still that way. I mean, I don't know. I've now studied, I don't know how many groups I've studied, hundreds by now. Mm-hmm. From the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece right on through. Mm-hmm. And I don't know of any other group that has such a complete, systematic way of pulling a person apart and rebuilding them. As we said at the beginning, I don't believe you can make a Manchurian candidate, mm-hmm. but you can most certainly create a situation where an individual is completely dependent upon these ideas, and you have that fundamental contradiction. Hubbard is all the time telling us it's a two-terminal universe. You've got the negative and the positive, the cathode and the anode. Everything's like this. Well, I don't think it is, personally. I think there's rather more to it. There's the weak nucleic force, there's the strong nucleic force, and there's also gravity. So there isn't just, the electromagnetic force, which is all he focuses on. But he then sets about using that to program people.
That's right. That's right.
The plus and minus, you are with us or you're against us. There is no spectrum. There is black, there is white, and everything is binary. Well, I'm not making this as a personal declaration or a sexual declaration, but I'm non-binary. This idea. I had a friend of mine the other week said to me that he was woke because if you're not woke, you're fascist.
What?
And I was like,
what?
How does that work?
What the fuck?
So I'm not allowed to have my own ideas. Now, with Scientology, the foundational criticism, and it's got to be said, you are becoming self-determined. That's the whole idea of Scientology. You are becoming completely yourself. And when you are completely yourself, you'll agree with Ron Hubbard 100%.
That's it. Because Hubbard sets himself up as the sole thing that is kind of outside of that whole binary, because he's source. And by being source, he's always present and always necessary. And that's a trick that every cult leader will pull in some fashion, is they are indispensable to you. You cannot do without them, no matter how free or OT or powerful or spiritual or enlightened you become. That guru is always necessary in your life.
Yeah. So what's happening is dependency is being created.
Exactly.
And to give Freud credit for one thing, when he talked about the Dianetic method before the First World War, I think in the year that Hubbard was born. So
1911.
Hubbard can't even claim that it was in a past life that he came up with this. But he talks about the method developed by Josef Breuer and used on Anna Fono, the first victim of analysis. And he describes the Dianetic method. You've got charge, you've got chains, you've got repeater technique to get somebody in. There is no doubt. And because Hubbard is saying, when I was 12, I became an expert on Freudian ideas, you're going, well, this could be a little bit of an admission here. But he then says the reason that I dropped this method is it does not resolve the transference. The foundational idea of analysis that our emotional attachment to others is developed in infancy, and we transfer from one, from a parent who we're attached to. So you have the positive and the negative, and you want to castrate your dad, and if you're a bloke, and have sex with your mum. I think Freud was, what's that expression that Robert De Niro, when it's being explained to him in the movie, that Freud was one sick fuck.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Right.
you should basically grow up. You should learn how to have real relationships that are not based upon this infantile perception of the world, which is called resolving the transference. The problem, and it is a huge problem that Freud points to, is that what would later be called Dianetics makes dependency more. It makes you ever more dependent upon the source. Now, to wind back to Joseph Breuer, who designed this method, and Anna Fono ended up in an asylum, a rehab, to get off the morphine that had been prescribed to her by Joseph Breuer. He signed the intake form for her. It's something that still exists. Anna Fono did not feel that she tremendously benefited from Dianetics. She didn't go clear.
Yeah, let's just say the least. So
we get to a point where Hubbard is using, it's a systematic form. Now, whether we call it brainwashing, and as I said at the beginning, I think if the Chinese want to call it brainwashing, they can. And maybe we should be a bit more cautious. So when academics say, oh, it's brainwashing's been disproven, I would like first a definition of brainwashing, and secondly, something that tells me why they believe that undue influence, which has been accepted in law for hundreds of years. I mean, the case I cite in Opening Our Minds, the book Opening Our Minds, is Francis Lord Bacon ruling on a case at the beginning of the 17th century in about 1612 or something. And so it's absolutely recognized that you can get somebody to do something that's against their own better interests.
That's right.
There is no real doubt of that.
Well, they've got
in this country.
If I might.
Yeah, you might.
Yeah, they've gotten away with two things, the academics on this in modern times, right? Which is one, creating this Manchurian candidate. I guess Hollywood contributed to this. Yeah, this
to use a Chinese expression.
Yeah, this nonsensical idea that it's permanent. That's the first thing. Is this idea that it's permanent, and if it's not, then it doesn't exist. That's the first logical fallacy that they throw out at you. They throw out this weird other definition of it, and the other one is and then if you throw that at them, they just ignore it. It's just ignorance. It's literally like ignoring facts.
Benjamin Zeller has made no response to my critique of his work. Nothing. Yeah. The journal that published it refused to publish my response to it because they hadn't commissioned it. And when Professor Stephen Kent went to them and said, look, this is good academic work, and isn't this how academia is meant to be? Yep. That somebody says something and somebody else criticizes it and we keep on moving. It's like, no, we're not going to do it. So, I hope Benjamin Zeller is watching this, or somebody who knows him. I would love to talk to him and have him explain to me what on earth he meant by these strange inventions in his paper.
Exactly, because they have to twist the facts, because the empirical evidence, and we see this even as recently, and I'll to refer to this, is even that Stolen Youth documentary on Hulu, the Larry Ray. Yeah, same drill. It's the same drill. You literally can see it on video. And I don't know what kind of mental gyration somebody has to go through to look at somebody who's having a psychotic episode at the initiation of the cult leader, Larry Ray, doing this to these college students, clearly right there on video, and they have to somehow twist this around to be, oh, no, that's not brainwashing. That's something else entirely. It's not even that bad. And look, they're fine now. And it's like, yeah, thank God they're fine now, because they got out from under the influence of this evil person who was quite literally purposefully driving them crazy. Right? That is a possible, real reality for any of us, is that somebody could do that to us. And for academics to just wholesale dismiss this arbitrarily as, well, I just know it's not that way. Screw you. You don't know anything. It's very clear. The fact I've lived it, you to a degree have lived it. We see this, we know this, we've experienced it. And now we understand it to a degree where we can break it down for other people and go, no, this is exactly how it works. And any human being is susceptible to it. And it only serves, and this is the part that gets a little tragic about this whole thing, is it only serves the cult leaders for the academics to say it's a fantasy. It only helps the bad guys. And that's where I think the academics either are bad guys or they just are so stupid that they don't think about the consequences of what they're saying. And I am harsh on this because I've lived it. And it's a very, very real thing. It's not, though, a permanent thing if you can get a person out of the environment. And that's crucial to recovery from this and healing from it.
Yeah, absolutely. A reinforcing environment. And the danger of Scientology, the most significant danger, I think, is it's self-reinforcing.
Yeah. That's right.
So as people come away from it, I'm told that somebody who calls himself Clearwater Chad commented on my channel the other day. And
me too. He came around to me too.
Spike just pulled the comment, so I wasn't able to respond to it because he's like, if you want the truth about Scientology, and it's like, oh dear, let's get into what truth is and what evidence is.
Yes.
And, we get to some pretty strange places. I did a piece on Holocaust denial with my friend Ed Stratton, and Ed listed 23 texts, all of them on the Holocaust, not his reading on the Nazis in general, but all of them, including the 3-volume estimation, which goes district by district through Europe and shows how many deaths there were. And it does add up to 6 million. Mm-hmm. That's not in the camps. That's the overall number. But it is so careful, this analysis. So you get somebody who does that kind of work. They've looked at the census in every country. They've looked at how many Jews are gone from that picture. They've gone through all of this. And then you get some guy who comes on and they've seen a little show on YouTube and they now know the truth. So that I fear that we have academics who have been, let me say this, brainwashed. We have academics who've been disinformed and misinformed, seeing Gordon Melton's pathetic work on Scientology. And our mutual friend James Beverley, Professor James Beverley, tells me that Gordon is really good factually on certain groups. And they've written a couple of books together. But I must say, all I've read is what he said about Scientology and what he said about Ramtha. And it's preposterous hyperbole. It's nonsense.
And let's not forget, this is the same guy who went over to Japan for Pimp for Shinrikyo on the day before all the evidence came out that they had put sarin gas into the metro system there. And he was saying it's impossible that could have ever happened.
Yeah.
Same guy.
Yeah. And we then find that Osahara had enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, as a student of religious belief or of faith, isn't it fascinating that their motivation was what is called power within the Buddhist system? And this is something, people have this airy-fairy notion of Buddhism. But, the Rohingya in Myanmar don't have such a positive view. The Tamils in Sri Lanka don't have such a positive view. And all of the Zen sects have apologized now for training the Japanese military to not have any compassion. And yet we are being told that mindfulness alone will lead to compassion. So we have these things. But this idea that power is the idea that, and it makes sense, people are stuck here because of their bad karma. So let's give them their bad karma. So, and I don't think he'd really worked it out, because all he wanted to do was kill all the Japanese people so their karma would be gone and they could be reborn afresh. Surely the thing to do is to torture them for as long as you possibly can.
Let's really get that karma to the positive side. Yeah.
Yeah. And how on earth anybody thinks that Mao, Stalin, Hitler could have got to the position they got to if there's any such thing as karma? I mean, sooner or later, something was going to have to stop them, and it should have stopped them a hell of a lot sooner than the 11 million that Stalin's responsible for, the 50 million that Hitler's responsible for, or the 70 million that Mao is responsible for. It didn't. But we buy into simplistic notions, and they then become, this is the core thing, the feeling of knowing.
Yeah.
Which William James pointed out, noesis, the idea of certainty. I know this is true because it feels right to me, which gives us QAnon and, the anti-vaxxing movement and so much else, when, and there are so many examples in history where, Semmelweis, the man who introduces the idea of washing your hands before helping babies to be born, and is basically single-handedly responsible for stopping childbed fever. He went crazy because of the criticism he received from other doctors. So you go, well, this learned profession said, wash our hands after we've performed an autopsy. Don't be ridiculous.
Right. People can be amazing at all ends of the spectrum, from genius to moron, and everything in between. And I keep going back to those emotional needs because they're kind of the thing that drives all of this. We like to think we're intellectual creatures, but we're not. Yeah,
it's Jill Bolt Taylor, the neuroscientist, who said words to the effect of, we believe that we are thinking creatures that feel, but we're actually feeling creatures that think.
Bingo. And that's where
That's right. If you try and separate thought and feeling in your head, well, good luck.
Exactly.
Subjective is where we live.
Exactly. And that's and this is important to stress, because you got to understand out there that when we're talking about brainwashing, we're talking about thought reform and mind control techniques and all that, we're talking about emotional manipulation way more than we're talking about rational manipulation. The rational manipulation comes in the data, the courses, the information, the you got overts, and that's because if you're, that's why your perceptions are bad. I mean, they'll feed you data, but it's the emotional manipulation that seals the deal and keeps you locked in. And and I just can't get past that enough. I can't say that enough. It's really important.
And that takes us to the notion of the weaponized empath, the idea that you can take somebody who is thoroughly pro-social, somebody who really cares about other people, not just somebody who kind of comes and goes, but somebody who's actually invested their life into doing good for others.
Yep.
And take such a person and turn them round by convincing them, for instance, that Jews are all infested with lice which carry disease.
Yep, that's right.
And actually should be treated as vermin.
That's right.
Basis for any genocide. They're not human, they're non-human. As soon as we get antisocial ideas, and let's face it, Scientology is absolutely packed with antisocial ideas, then we'll have something dangerous. If you can then get an empath, then the smarter they are, I've used this expression many times, we use our intelligence to buttress our stupidity.
I like that. I love that expression.
And, so if you want to hear stupid, then, go and look at Isaac Newton, who's come up once in this conversation. Newton is one of the greatest minds in all history. His work on gravity, his work on optics, it changed the world. It changed how we do things.
That's right.
However, he spent much more time doing alchemy and trying to find out from the Bible, which he believed was encoded, the dimensions of Solomon's temple, which would be encoded. If you could find that out, then you'd know the dimensions of the universe, he believed. So he did most of his scientific work by the time he was about 25, and then went progressively mad because as an alchemist, he was imbibing mercury. And so
that's the part I didn't know.
It's not good for you, apparently.
No, it's not. That makes that whole story make a lot more sense to me, though, because I could never reconcile how off the rails he went or why. And so that helps me understand that.
Yeah, and he was a tremendously vindictive man. I mean, it's said that his statement about seeing further because he stood on the shoulders of giants was an allusion to Robert Hooke, who was a very small man and who should be viewed with the same awe, definitely, the Micrographia, incredible scientist. He had Hooke's, when he was president of the Royal Society, he had Hooke's portrait burned.
Yes. Major rivalry there, major problems, yeah.
And because, of the calculus, because his fluxions, which he would not share with anyone, were given out by Leibniz, there was an investigation the Royal Society sponsored into Leibniz to see how he'd stolen the fluxions and released them as a calculus. And it determined that he had stolen them from Newton. It was only, I think, in the 1990s when records were open, they found there was a one-man committee, Isaac Newton, who had done this investigation. That's how. So exactly what you say. We have to be seen as emotional as well as rational creatures. Yeah. And at the point where we become attached to a dangerous person or a dangerous idea, we become dangerous. We become harmful to others. So anything that's dehumanizing, anything that's antisocial, anything that harms other people is a bad thing from my perspective. And Scientology, doubly so.
Exactly.
It's an awful thing.
Exactly. Couldn't put it better. It's, it's just a fact of life that we are susceptible to these things, that we need to be cautious sometimes, mindful, if you will, of the fact that predators are real. They exist. They're out there, and their job, their entire mission in life is taking advantage of people. And sometimes such people get into positions of power where they can control not just a couple people, they can control a lot of people. And the most effective way of doing that is figured out already through Bernays' work, through the Chinese and the Russians, and through what we've documented, through what Lifton documented. We've broken this stuff down. Pavlov, that's right. Oh my God, what a monster that man was. Because I've seen those films with the kids, and it was revolting. Pavlov was a monster. So, you have people in history who have figured this stuff out and documented it. This stuff has been known about in one form or another all over the world for millennia. But we're documenting it, we're talking about it, we're breaking it down. So because there are things you can do to spot it, safeguard against it, prevent it, if you know about it. And if I've got any mission, and I think Jon too, in educating and talking about this stuff, I love talking to Jon, and I love having these long talks with him. But the point is, notice this stuff out there. Do something about it. You can, and you need to, because this stuff isn't going to stop. The predators aren't going to stop being born, and they're not going to stop preying on us. So we're the ones who have to have the responsibility for ourselves and leading our lives to know that they're out there and they do this stuff. And they do it at the government level, they do it at the city, state level, and they do it in our personal lives, at the church level, at the job level, at the family level. The only protection is knowing about it. And then goosing yourself to do something about it, even though it feels like it's a little weird in the moment. It might be a little weird, but it's going to save you about 10 years of hell. So it's worth taking the time,
It's for sure. And living in a society where, the contradictions run so rife that we know about conspicuous consumption. We know that we are driven to buy rubbish that is, just the amount of plastic in the ocean, the amount of plastic that, we have, the human race has done these awful things and justified it. We're now seeing more and more documents coming out from the oil companies showing that in the 1970s, they had very good predictions about climate change.
That's right.
They knew this was going to happen, and they then buried it. And they're now, of course, fighting various court cases in the US trying to defend themselves. The fact that the PR firms that supported big tobacco, as that battle was being finally lost, they were then hired by the oil companies. There's an amazing memo from the 1950s. It's from what is now called Exxon, SO. I think Standard Oil, if we start off with SO. And in the early 50s, they had a secret meeting with one of their PR people, and he said, this is from Stuart Ewan's book on PR, excellent book, professor writing about PR. They had this meeting where the PR experts said, we have to be viewed as a religion. Consumer products have to move into the realm of faith. And that was the beginning of an incredible, you then see interviews. One of the ones that startled me was Pepsi Cola. that this guy was being interviewed, and he said, "Yeah, I look at the can and I see the red, white, and blue, and it makes me feel patriotic."
Right.
And you get how this stuff is going on. So you have the industry of consumption, and I do mean that in both senses of the word consumption, trying to keep us in this adolescent state.
Yeah.
Promising us, that the Garden of Eden is, all you've got to do is watch this movie or do this. All of this complete trashy hype that we're subjected to. It's coming through that. And first of all going, this is really unsatisfying and it's making me ill. The rubbish food, the ultra processed food, chicken nuggets and things they're basically factory made.
That's right.
It's a bit of meat that might be a year old by now that's had xanthan gum put in it, what have you. So we are literally being poisoned, and we're also psychologically being poisoned. And the way out of that is basically to say, actually, you can have a good life as a human being, but not by being enslaved.
Exactly.
Not by having your mind made up for you.
That's right.
By thinking, by participating, and by growing up, by realizing that adulthood's actually a really good thing, whereas being a child and being dependent on stupid ideas and crazy products, and narcissism that swims around in that, it's just not useful for us. And Scientology it infantilizes people. Have things like the key to life, where you're just being reduced all the time as if you're a complete idiot. I would love it to have had that conversation with Ron Hubbard. I would love to have sat with him in his prison cell and got the story out of him of, as we know, when Charlie Nairn, just before he filmed The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, which I still believe is the greatest single document about Scientology in existence, he said to Hubbard, it's a scam, isn't it? And Hubbard went, yeah, obviously, anyone can see that. And why do you do it? Well, it's nice to give my wife $10,000 a day in 1968.
Yep. Yeah.
But mainly, I like to catch the clever ones and reel them in.
That's the one.
That little 10-year-old boy who's so upset that the other kids are calling him fat and spotty and a ginge, who's going to get his own back on the rest of us. And that's what Scientology is.
That's right.
It's the revenge of an inadequate and desperate man who suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, manic depression, paranoia, attention deficit disorder, you name it. He'd got all of this stuff going on. And if you want to actually be like him, do Scientology.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you,
white tape route.
we've talked about that quote before, and here's something I'll contribute to it that I've not said before. I used to look forward to the clever ones when I was in Scientology.
Oh, me too. Recruiting people who were opposed to Scientology and clever.
Oh, I couldn't wait to take them down. And I actually was pretty good at it. And it's weird how I had never heard that quote from Hubbard, didn't know he said that, had no clue he had. And in fact, if I had learned that, I probably would have thought it was a clever line as a Scientologist, actually, because my thinking had already gone so parallel with Hubbard's, you see. And so that's kind of the point I'm making here is even unconsciously, you don't have to get told every little thing you're going to think. It doesn't even have to work that way. In terms of here, we're talking about brainwashing. Let's not forget the victim is contributing to the process. They have to, or it doesn't work. They have their imagination, hypnotism, guided imagination, right? They have to contribute to it or it doesn't work. And that's why we think if we can educate, maybe we can, that is enough that you could resist enough that you're not contributing to the problem. And that's kind of really the anatomy of it, as awful as that sounds. And it's not a matter of trying to blame everybody. I'm just stating a fact. It takes two to have a fight. It takes two to get brainwashed. That's how it works. You don't have to cooperate with it. You don't have to be a victim of it, but you got to really understand it if you're going to really stand up to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was asked to go over the rainbow and join L. Ron Hubbard's personal staff and actually play drums on the Road to Freedom. I'm so glad I didn't.
Me too.
But initially I said, yeah, I'll come for a year and do that. And of course, the comeback on that was, no, you have to add some zeros to that.
That's right.
It's 1 billion years. And I just said, no, I'm not doing it. And later when I read Adele Hartwell, Ernie Hartwell, talking about La Quinta and the horrific conditions, I had to stop and go, I'm not sure that I would have resisted that. I would have been able to resist that.
Yep.
So while it is worth pointing out that one of the great tango teachers of all time actually does a course called It Takes One to Tango.
Oh.
Yep. And indeed, there's a book called It Takes One to Tango, which is written by a diplomat who had a long-term career, showing that sometimes somebody can overwhelm you, and
that's true. That's definitely true.
As you say, there'll be a participant process.
Yeah.
And there has to come a point where you stop participating, which is where critical thinking becomes kind of vital.
That's right.
But we are so easily golden tricked, and I believe profoundly that that's because of our educational system. I believe that because we have a fundamentally authoritarian approach to education, and it is changing. I mean, Ken Robinson's work, Matthew Lipman's work, there are hundreds of schools that now reject the cookie cutter model.
Yep.
And, you will learn the answers to the SATs questions. You'll be useless in life, but you will have got this piece of paper that says that, you've got your GED or what have you.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So I think there's an imbalance of power that we also have to add to the equation, that while it does require your participation.
No, you're absolutely right. I realize in saying that whole screed that it comes across or could be interpreted as, in the victim blaming realm. And I'm not trying to go there at all.
No.
I was trying to make the point that it is a cooperative effort, but you're absolutely right. And again, if you want an example of this that's not in the Scientology world, I'll point to Larry Ray again, and I'll point to that documentary again, because it'll show it to you. I mean, all those kids were kind of active participants, but you cannot in any point along the narrative blame those kids for what the hell happened to them. And that's not the point of view that I'm trying to bring to this. I'm just trying to say you can resist, you can fight back, you don't have to be a victim of it. But not if you don't understand what's going on.
Yeah, and if you've not had the education to see how it's working, if you've been brought up to believe that you should be obedient, then, I mean, the other end of it, and I recommend this to everybody. Have you seen the documentary Kumare?
Yes. Yes, I have.
Because here you see somebody with interesting intentions who is not at all malevolent.
That's right.
And you see how people give him power over them.
That's right.
And
that's what I'm talking about. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he then went on to make a soapy movie about Barack Obama, but can't be helped.
But it was quite a fascinating documentary in that cult leader follower relationship.
Yeah. Somebody
really
who has no techniques and no wisdom and nothing, and just says, I'm a New Jersey boy, but I'm of Indian, South Asian descent. I'll grow a beard and put an orange robe on and talk like my grandma.
Yep.
And just walk around any town in Arizona, and people will start going, hey, will you teach me yoga?
Yep. And before he knew it, he had a cult following. I mean, by design. I mean, he was doing this on purpose. It's fascinating. It's really interesting, especially when he reveals the truth.
When you meditate, Chris, you use the blue light. You use the blue light when you meditate.
Yes, of course.
Brilliant documentary.
Yes, it was. It was very good. I think we should probably move toward wrapping up.
Yeah, I think we've reached a point of exhaustion and fatigue where, are you willing to confess now?
Oh, very much so. Well, let me ask you this. Let me maybe move toward ending with this. somebody asked me the other day in a live stream when I was doing a talk about brainwashing. I was talking about sleep and food deprivation mainly because of the power of those things. And I fully realize that if I was in a controlled environment that was not under my control, I could be brainwashed.
Yes.
With everything I know. You could put me in a situation where I don't have the ability to resist. If you break me down, you give it about...
We refuse to give you a prawn sandwich anymore and you break.
I mean, stick me in a prison cell, something like that. But I'm talking about food and sleep deprivation. You stick me in Guantanamo or wherever, I'm not going to be able to resist that. That's overwhelming force. Right? And it will tear you down. We're talking about stuff that tends to be a lot less than that. Walking into a Scientology org or walking into Kabbalah Center or something. I mean, you're not going to get tortured. So the brainwashing is
to death possibly, but
yeah, that's for sure. So it can take a while. It's kind of there's lots of ways of going about this, but the point is that there isn't any human being, I don't think, who couldn't be broken. It's just a matter of time, right? But that's with overwhelming force. In the day-to-day social situations that most of us run into, especially in the Western world, we have a lot of power of choice. And that's where this education comes in handy, But I don't want to give any pretense here that this will make you brainwash proof, because I don't think there is such a thing if you really go all in on these techniques.
Yeah, and it's a matter of being able to resist the smaller inducements.
Yes.
To enslavement. I think possibly it is possible that a tiny proportion of human beings are beyond brainwashing.
Okay.
But they're the people we call psychopaths. And
that's an interesting point.
Yeah, but otherwise, I agree with you that and even there, it is possible. It's been shown you can positively influence psychopaths and get them to change their ways. And there's partly a natural idea that over the age of 50, people tend to calm down. I saw an incredible interview with a guy who'd spent most of his violent criminal, spent most of his life in prison. And he'd gone to a therapist who happened to be a psychiatrist who dealt with psychopaths. There aren't very many. And allowed their conversations to be recorded. And he just basically said, I don't want to live this way anymore. This is a rotten life I have. I'm sick and tired of being in prison. I want to get better. I want to change.
Wow.
And it wasn't for a parole board, so it wasn't something he'd been let out. And so there, I think there is a natural thing there, but I think there are people but the proportion of psychopaths in the population is held to be about 3% of men and about 1% of women. So 2% of people overall. It's not that many. And the thing, for me, perhaps a final point for this conversation is to say, by understanding this problem, we can actually change the human future. Yeah. And most of the people I talk to in this field put on a happy face and they're cheerful and bright in public. But when I sit down with them privately, many people will say they have no hope for humanity. They think it's all ruined now. We're not going to save people. The predators are going to win. I don't hold that point of view. And I think to change that, once you think it's inevitable that everything's going to fail, it will fail.
Yeah.
I think we are at an incredible turning point where we do have all of the tools to change this, and we're not using them. The idea that two guys like you and me, that you and I, that we are talking about this, whereas the 100,000 psychologists in the world are, if they get to it at all, are sort of saying, well, you see, the Milgram experiment was wrong ethically, right, because you shouldn't do that to people, and so we mustn't learn anything from it.
Right.
Exactly. I think that by recognizing the authoritarian strand in our nature and recognizing this need to have this childish dependence on others and their wisdom, we can actually change as a species. We can do something wonderful. We don't have to keep going in this, lemming-like pursuit. And I'm told it's not true what they say about lemmings. They're actually very sociable and don't commit suicide. But this pursuit of suicide, which seems to be fundamental to the human race, don't want to get into Freud and the death wish, Thanatos, all of that nonsense. And I think there's a bit more to it. Ernst Becker would probably be a better source than Freud on this. But nonetheless, we don't have to be that. We can actually do wonderful and positive things, and we can have a good time doing it.
That's right.
Which is the other thing, because we can have the camaraderie, and the friendship that you and I have developed by trying to do something positive in the world, rather than the glee of destruction.
Yes,
that,
exactly. I will agree with you 100% on that. I really will. The only times I get down or depressed, whatever, as I realized recently, there's a lot of lies going on in your head when you're in a depressive episode. You're ignoring an awful lot of good stuff when
tinted,
when I'm in that space, right? And so I can agree completely that really, from a more rational, objective perspective, it's absolutely, I will accent the positive there.
Accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative. Latch on to the affirmative. Do not mess with Mr. in between.
Oh my
God, sage
stop it. I forgot about that. John quoting Scientology at me.
Well, no, it's Bing Crosby, actually.
Oh, wait, that's right. I'm sorry. I got that confused with the fucking, my bad.
Splurge on it.
Yes.
That's Scientology.
I was getting confused with Hubbard's Spirit of Play crap. That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I'll go with being 100% of the time on that one. That's it. Okay, good. John, all right, let's wrap up. Thank you very much for joining me in this, and for your channel as well. We love you guys. You guys are the best. And
let's say that if somebody watching this on my channel, please go and subscribe to Chris's channel. And if you're watching on Chris's channel, come and do that. And if you've got a few bucks and can manage Patreon, we are working out devious things that we can offer to you that no one else will get. Exclusive offers. I was the other week, I was like, why am I doing this? This is just stupid. For what? I haven't made a single cent in 4 years doing this. We are almost supporting half of Spike's livelihood from what we do. And why am I doing this? And then I came and looked at all the positive comments on the thing I'd done. Now, the thing I'd done was read out to camera a paper that I delivered in 2013 in Copenhagen.
Yes.
The keynote paper at the FECRIS conference. And it's been online ever since then. And I read it out and people go, oh, wow, this is great. So I went, people want me to read things out loud. Okay. So what I've just done, and we're going to get to soon, is my little booklet, Scientology, The Cult of Greed, which I still believe is the basic primer, or as Americans sometimes say, primer. I'm not really sure why. On Scientology, that's what it was meant to be. And I've spent more time on this than anybody else because I'm more foolish than anybody else, probably. But I thought I'll read it out loud. And that way we've got an audio book, but on my channel exclusively for Patreon patrons, they can watch me reading it out loud. And we will get to Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, but that might take a few days to.
I get asked about that a lot, John. People really do want that as an audiobook.
Yeah, I'm on it. I was actually going to start work on it today, but I've spent so much time talking to you.
I know. I'm talking. I get in your way. Well, let's wrap up then.
Not at all.
Absolutely. No. And actually, you bring this up, and I've always said all my content on my YouTube channel will be free, but I wonder if I shouldn't get around that a little bit on Patreon and start putting up some Patreon only stuff. If any of my viewers out there, by the way, on my end of this conversation are interested in anything along those lines, do let me know, because I'm always interested in giving you guys more data that you want. And if that's a way of going about doing it, I'll do it.
Yeah, and let's face it, as Aaron Hubbard said, free service, free fall. So, if you don't pay us, then you're going to go to hell.
There you go.
Easy, really. But no, my dilemma over the whole Patreon thing, and I think Jack Conte and Patreon absolutely brilliant as an idea.
Yeah.
But the whole exclusive content, it's like, I don't want to deny information.
Exactly.
So by having these wonderful videos of me reading from a book, that's, what a spectacular and wonderful thing to offer to people. I won't be sitting on any cakes. Spike suggested that, said that could be quite good, but I won't be doing that. And I will not be taking my top off to read this. Sorry. But
I think the general viewing public will be quite happy about that. In the same way that nobody wants to see this guy.
How dare you? How dare you, sir?
Yeah. All right. Let's wrap up. Folks out there, thanks for coming around and listening to us gabber on at a mad rate about all of this. We really hope all of this was entertaining, informative, and educational for you. That is always the goal. Thanks for coming around. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, thanks so much. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.